Hi, friends. This is Carrie Morrison, and thank you for joining me again at Heartforward Conversations from the Heart. I am sure somebody has the pithy quote I am looking for as I introduce this next episode. It would say something like, "You can grow numb and indifferent to the things you see around you each and every day until you walk alongside someone who is seeing it for the very first time. And then their shock can trigger your shame." Such was the experience when we brought a delegation of 5 representing Italy to Los Angeles in September 2018. We all know that the suffering that is visible on our streets is a human tragedy, but we continue to be flummoxed in our response to intervene, and it persists. Today's conversation is with 2 members of that delegation, Dr. Roberto Mezzina, joining us from Trieste, Italy, and Dr. Sashidharan from Glasgow in Scotland. Here will be an opportunity to learn a bit more about the visionary psychiatrist, Dr. Franco Basaglia, who is credited with pushing for the groundbreaking law to close the asylums in Italy in the late 1970s. He imagined a community-based mental health system, something we were supposed to create in America but never did. And until just last year, Dr. Mezzina was the leader of that system. But today you will also have an opportunity to see Los Angeles through their eyes. Coming from a city where there are no locked doors in their hospital and restraints are forbidden by law, they will share how they felt when they saw how ubiquitous are restraints in our system, in our emergency rooms and hospitals, in the jail where inmates are chained to furniture. And where there are no visible chains or restraints, you'll hear Dr. Mezzina describe his experience of seeing Skid Row as an asylum without walls. So often people will say to me, "Why did you have to go all the way to Italy to learn about a better way?" I trust after you listen to this conversation, you will understand that we have much to learn from others. Well, good morning, or actually what I should say is buonasera in Italy, and to my friend Dr. Sashidharan in Glasgow, Dr. Roberto Mezzina in Trieste. It's evening there, and here I have sun coming in on a lovely November morning in Los Angeles, but it's really a pleasure to see you both today, and I'm so delighted to have you on Heartforward podcast. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hello, Carrie.
I know it'll be a little bit hard for us to talk over each other. Don't worry about it. I think people understand when we're having a Zoom conversation, we all have this experience. So do not hesitate to break in when you have thoughts or ideas. So the way I like to start these conversations is always to learn a little bit about your background. And I realize that in as much as I've had the pleasure to know each of you for a couple of years, I really don't know your origin story. So Roberto, maybe can we start with you? I know that you recently retired after a long and just very excellent career with the mental health system in Trieste. But tell us a little bit about what brought you into the field of psychiatry when you made that decision, and a little bit about your early days, how that informed who you are today.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. I was a medical student in my original hometown, Bari, which is in the south of Italy, in Puglia, and I was thinking what to do because I was not so much passionate with the medical profession, to be honest. So I tried to find something which was more meaningful for me. And I think being engaged in what at that time was the movement for a better mental health in Italy, and which is called Psychiatria Democratica, run by Franco Basaglia and other leaders. It was a fantastic group of leaders at that time. So this attracted me so much. And I thought I could be a doctor without being a real doctor in the sense of using the white coat but just, spending time with people, helping people, and also having some form of social or maybe political engagement and personal engagement. This was my real motivation at the time. Well, and then I moved to Trieste because Trieste was the most attractive place, even if I visited another couple of places like Arezzo and Perugia at the time, also very interesting for the Italian reforms. And this was just about 1 year before the famous 1978 law, the 180 law, the reform law called by the name of Franco Basaglia. And this law was such a shock, but at the time it arrived at the climax of a movement that was very much critical toward mental hospitals in Italy. And so all the practices to improve the conditions of people inside the hospitals, to foresee a possible alternative, to try to make something different than providing medications and controlling their behavior was so important for me. So we started to visit these experiences. And then at the end, I had a chance to go to Trieste like a postgraduate student and also with a grant. And then I started to work within the team.
I want to return to that time in the 1970s, but let's bring Sashi on a parallel track. Sashi, tell me about your origin story and how it is that you entered this field, and then maybe how you found your way ultimately to Trieste.
Well, I grew up in India, southern part of India, and I went to medical school there. And my interest in psychiatry, particularly in the injustices in the mental health system, those were peaked while I was at medical school. And like Roberto, I wasn't greatly taken in by the attractions of working as a physical health doctor. Perhaps quite unfairly, I thought it was rather mechanical and programmatic. And mental health really interested me because it offered a new challenge. And at around that time, it was I was getting involved in a number of social movements. And around me, I could see a number of people with significant mental health problems who were receiving little care or attention. And that certainly propelled me towards a career in psychiatry. And then I came across some remarkable people, particularly remarkable Indian psychiatrists of that time, who told me about the fundamental divisions that existed within psychiatry between the rich and the poor, and how psychiatry was quite different from other types of medical disciplines. And the idea of psychiatry being part of the social struggle at that time in India certainly attracted me to this. And then when I came over to the United Kingdom after that to do my training in psychiatry, I became even more aware of the plight of the people with serious mental illness. I started in psychiatric training in an old-style asylum in the north of England. And I was appalled by the lack of humanity within this place called the hospital. Although people were supposed to be getting care and attention and treatment, they were largely neglected. And the whole system was premised on segregation of severely mentally ill people. And then I went on to start my proper training in Edinburgh in Scotland. I was first attracted by the movement towards therapeutic communities in a small place in Scotland, south of Edinburgh, a place called Dingleton, where a very charismatic psychiatrist named Maxwell Jones started talking about the negative, toxic effects of the institution on people who had been contained and confined there. And through that, I came to know about what was happening in Trieste. And I visited Trieste at that time while I was a trainee, although I presume Roberto was also training in Trieste at that time, or paths did not cross then. But I was certainly greatly enthused by what was happening in Trieste. And my eyes were fully open to the fundamental contradictions that pervaded psychiatric practice at that time. And that was my journey to becoming a social stroke community psychiatrist and fully engaged with issues around inequality, unfairness, exclusion within mental health services, and also trying to change that system from within through developing innovations, not just in terms of practice, but also changing the way services are configured, organized, and delivered.
So it would perhaps be fair to say that both of you were there in Trieste at the same time in the 70s without knowing each other yet, maybe even having your Alperol spritz at the same cafe a few tables away.
No, I can maybe add that I had very quick training in the as a medical student in a university academic clinic, psychiatric clinic of Bari, where I was particularly shocked, not just by the physical restraint. It was used normally as a normal thing, but by the use of ECT, electroshock, that was such a inhumane practice at the time. And they used electroshock with two apparent reasons. One was a therapeutic one, saying, okay, these guys are not improving, so we know that for manic state, it's a good thing. So we can try this, and it can make some cycle of electroshock. And I remember some people really demented at the time by doing and having relapses and going back, etc. And the second reason was when someone was opposing to the rules of the world. So it was a clear form of punishment, so a clear form of keeping the power on these people. So I was so disgusted with my original idea to do a psychiatry that I turned back to nephrology, and for a while I was not trying. So it was just a chance when I decided to leave Bari and visit these places, and so I went to Trieste. So where I was very lucky because I was included in the real work from the very beginning. At that time, I had the responsibility of an infirmary ward with a lot of demented people, a very regressed one. It was probably the last one open in the city, in the old asylum in the city. And this was a very important experience for me. In 2 months, we discovered a group of 30 people there. Many of them can improve their condition. They can maybe discharged, go to a group home. They had a fantastic holiday in the mountains, supported by nurses. The group of nurses, which was terrible because they were all punished, put there because they were people which were using sometimes violence or they were stealing things. It was a punishment for the patients, and for the inpatients, and for the staff too. So it was really a snake pit. But at the end, we found a way to give a chance to anybody to improve and to recover. So it was a parallel process of recovery of staff and so-called demented or very much regressed patients with schizophrenia for 30, 40 years. And they were in the hospital like the last resort, and it was completely considered to be not recoverable. So, and we did something. So the ward was closed in 2 months' time, and we resettled them in some other facilities, mostly group homes, with the support of nurses that were developing at the time. So this was a very important experience for me in the beginning.
You know, I heard a lot of stories about how many young psychiatrists came to Trieste to be part of this movement, to be part of this revolution, as it were, and had time to spend with Dr. Basaglia. In fact, there's photos in the Dipartimento di Salute Mentale building of the young psychiatrists all gathered around Dr. Basaglia. And I'm hoping that if there are young psychiatrists listening to this podcast today in the United States, they will feel the same tug that you felt, that there is a better way. For both of you, Sashi, did you have the opportunity to meet Dr. Basaglia?
No, I never met Basaglia. Once I was exposed to Trieste, and it's interesting that Roberto talks about this experience of taking patients up to the mountains, inmates up to the mountain. And in fact, that was one of the first films that I saw. There was an English language film that was made. I think it was actually screened in UK, in BBC, of this program of nurses and the patients from a long stay ward in Trieste, in their words, running away from the hospital on holiday, and how they showed the people before they went on holiday. They were, as Roberto said, they use a psychiatric term, catatonic and mutant, not being able to communicate with people. And when they went on holiday, and when they were living in the space, they all came to their own because they had independence and they were interacting with their operators. And at the end of the holiday, they said, we don't want to go back. And that's a very profound thing. People saying, we don't want to go back. We don't want to go back.
I know that place probably was Villa Fulcis, was used like a possibility to spend at least 1 month outside of the hospital, of group of patients going there, like, to break a different atmosphere and figure out how can be a possible different future for them.
Oh, I love that.
The staff, the doctors and the nurses with the patients at that time said, yes, we don't have to go back. You could actually see the scales falling from their eyes. And they literally came to this realization that we don't necessarily have to go back. And there is a better option available. There are possibilities here. And that really was very exciting to watch that. And then to begin to understand through my exposure to what is happening in Trieste and reading about what is happening there and Basaglia's writings, that it is possible to not just imagine a different way of doing things, but we can actually practically do that.
I get goosebumps hearing about that, Sashi. I want to find that movie and maybe I can connect it to the episode notes for this podcast. I imagine taking 30 people from LA County Jail up to Yosemite to go camping for a month. Can you imagine how beautiful that would be? So, Roberto, Dr. Basaglia is not really known in the United States. I'm not really quite sure why, but, just give us a little glimpse into his vision. And I have that same book too. I will actually include it in the show notes also. Tell us about him.
Yes, Franco Basaglia was a doctor from Venice. He came out from an affluent family, and he started to practice medicine and psychiatry with dedication to people. He was famous because he spent the whole day and till the late evening in the ward of the University Clinic of Padua, where he was training as an academic psychiatrist. But then he started to read philosophy, and he was very much listening to patients. It was very strange at the time. So spending time with them in the ward. And so he with some other young guys like Antonio Slavic, who became his great friend and companion of his adventure. So they started to try to understand people with schizophrenia, listening to them and trying to improve their condition. But he started to be interested in philosophy and also in politics. So he started to write very strange pieces on the academic journals and present to national and then international congresses. So he was known as the psychiatrist philosopher or the philosopher psychiatrist. And at the end of the day, his boss, the University of Padua, promoted him. He fired Basaglia, sending him to direct the hospital, the psychiatric hospital in Gorizia. Gorizia is a small town just on the border with Slovenia. At that time, the hospital, just the back wall of the hospital was on the border. So if someone jump off, he can be arrested by Yugoslavian police at the time. So this was a place with 600 people at the time, completely abandoned because it was at the edge of the country, nobody there, almost very few doctors, nurses completely discouraged to do something, where people were doing nothing, and these bodies were contained there. There are no people but bodies, like objects. So he tries to do something with very small things and trying to make sense why they were there. And so they invented small things to do, like the work, trying to make some work inside, but moving stones in the beginning. So something like that, just to create some forms of life and exchange by doing things. And then started with the experience of the famous assemblies. So using the approach of the therapeutic community that Sashi mentioned before, that he was taking from the UK, so from Scotland particularly. But in the Italian version, this became really a sort of participation of people to the decision and to the discussion about their needs. So they started to have a voice with a lot of difficulties at the beginning. They didn't speak, and the staff was completely against. So the nurses were trying to boycott these kind of things. But at the end, it started to move, and then Gorizia became a famous experiment to open the doors and from the wards and in the gardens of the hospital, and then outside, bringing people outside. So around 1968, Gorizia was famous because Basaglia published the famous book, L'Istituzione Negata, the institution negated, or something.
Which has never been translated into English.
It was a famous, it was an incredible success. It was as a book for the 68 generations. So like Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse book, One Dimensional Man, or other books of that time. So Basaglia was very much inspiring because this describes how this process of democratization and recognition of the subjectivity of the patient was so powerful, and changing the role of psychiatrists and medical staff from the custodial role, controlling people, taking people locked inside, from a therapeutic therapeutic role or a friendship role even. So helping people to get back to their original lives, social networks, social connections, etc., etc. So Basaglia started with his work in Gorizia. It was sacked again because the politics was like that. Then he started again in Trieste in the 70s, because he started in 61 in Gorizia and in 71 in Trieste, where he had more support by the administration, a sort of green card. So Michele Zanetti helped him, called him as a director. Zanetti was the president of the province responsible for the hospital. And then so he became the great architect of this change. And he called a lot of young doctors to change the attitude and the approach, and a number of things happened at the time. So Trieste, in 9 years' time, closed this psychiatric hospital.
There is a movie that you brought to our attention about Basaglia in Gorizia. Do you remember the name of that movie? Because I'll include it in the show notes for this episode. It's a movie about him as a young psychiatrist at Gorizia.
It was, in fact, a report of the famous television broadcast TV7, which was a very important broadcast and Italian program in Italian television at the time. And famous journalist Sergio Zavoli interviewed the inpatients and Basaglia. And the famous question was, Dr. Basaglia, are you more interested in the illness or in the patient? He said, well, definitely in the man, in the person. I'm not interested in the illness per se. So he also mentioned that illness is a product of even of our contradiction as normal people, as society. It's not just something inside the person. It's something in a relationship that creates because of our internal contradiction related to power and other things. So he started to work with this different approach, looking at the person instead of the illness and the treatment of the illness.
So we're going to have to fast forward a couple decades, because otherwise we'll be talking for hours. I want to start with the notion that the Trieste mental health system is recognized by the World Health Organization as a collaborating center for community-based mental health. What does that mean to be recognized by the World Health Organization, and what significance does that confer on the work being done there for either of you?
Well, in the very early days, Trieste was one of the pilot center for deinstitutionalization in Europe, particularly, and was supported in the 70s. But then in the 1987, it became a WHO collaborating center because of the outstanding quality of the practice, because at that time it already demonstrated that it's possible to create a network of services in the community which is completely alternative to the old psychiatric hospital. The hospital was closed in 1980, so the WHO, particularly Dr. Norman Sartorius, who was the director at the time, recognized and proposed to Trieste, with the help of other people like Benedetto Saraceno and Michele Tansella, so other prominent people, to be a lead in the process of rehabilitation, particularly community-based services, and so also helping others to do their own pathway toward better mental health care. So this was the very first recognition. Then in recent years, we were more and more, used, let me say, as a sort of demonstration of human rights, of a possible human rights-based approach, because we don't use seclusion, we don't use restraint. I can say we never use restraint. Someone can say, well, but use medication. Sometimes medication are forms of restraint. That's okay. We can accept at that point, but we never use physical restraint or locked doors. So it's more and more established system of open door in any place of the system. So we have no locked doors anywhere, including the general hospital, for instance, little ward that we have, or more recently the small forensic unit with 2 beds. Everything, everywhere, the open door, which is also a symbol of open access, and the possibility of getting out is a symbol of freedom. So the famous sentence was "La libertà è terapeutica," freedom is therapeutic. Was written on, and still is, on the walls of one of the wards of the psychiatric hospital. And today we're in a way in a process of saying that we need freedom as a first premise So freedom first, even before talking about care and treatment. So because freedom is a fundamental, important human right. Important human right. And so together with freedom, we need other things, of course, but we never can use freedom as, as the result of someone good behavior. So freedom can be...
It can't be the reward.
Yes, can see.
Sashi, I see you want to jump in. And Sashi, as you answer, I want to also ask you this question. The first time I attended one of the conferences in Trieste in 2017, I noticed that there were over 35 countries represented there who had come to learn. And you, representing someone who's been in the United Kingdom and working with other countries, what is the appeal for all these other countries to come and learn from the system?
I want to walk back a little bit, if you could allow me to do that, going back to the question of Basaglia, because it's important to say this. Basaglia was such a transformative leader in relation to mental health services. There were significant and such important things happening in Italy in the 1970s, way back 1960s, 70s, certainly when I was training as a psychiatrist in one of the most prestigious psychiatric institutions in this country, in Edinburgh. We didn't hear a word about what was happening just at our doorstep. None of our professors, our psychiatrists ever uttered the word Basaglia. And these were people who were at the cutting edge of mental health, psychiatry, who knew everything that was happening everywhere in relation to psychiatric progress, innovations, research, but not a whisper about Basaglia. And some of us had to find our way to Trieste, although this knowledge, this absolutely wonderful experience that was unfolding in Italy was in many ways hidden from us. And it makes you ask the question, why? Why was this happening? Because historically, I believe not just in the United Kingdom, but an Anglo-American blind spot to what was happening in Italy, because it challenged the way that predominantly Anglo-American psychiatry was organized and its underlying premises around mental illness being primarily, if not exclusively, a brain disorder, it being an integral part of general medicine, rather than psychiatry has as its roots outside of that in the social world. And there was a reluctance to try and understand that connection. And there was, I believe, an active attempt not just to turn a deaf ear to what was happening in Trieste, but also an attempt to try and discredit that as a political movement rather than a movement within mental health as we understood it. And it's important to understand that, because that explains to a large degree why even now within our curriculum of psychiatrists and training of psychiatrists, Italy is very rarely mentioned, or it's only mentioned as an example of how what has been caricatured as anti-psychiatry, Italy is part of that. And that is a complete misreading, in my view, of what's happened in Italy and the significance of Basaglia and Trieste. Now, it's interestingly that over the last 10, 20 years, there has been an interest in Trieste, if not in Basaglia. It's also interesting to understand that, because in spite of huge amounts of money being spent in mental health services in rich countries like the UK and the United States, outcomes for people with mental health problems has remained depressingly poor, unsatisfactory. And the systems that we have set up have begun to come apart because they're not fit for purpose, either in the United Kingdom or more obviously in the United States. Even our expeditions in the community mental health care in the United Kingdom are beginning to come unstuck. Our services are not fit for purpose. So increasingly, there is a movement towards looking at what has worked and what works. And of course, Trieste, as you said earlier, has been cited by a lot of people as a place where not just things work, but also people who go through the system come out and say, that was a good experience. I got better, or my son got better. And here, we come into contact with people all the time. People saying that we've been researching into this, and they seem to do it differently in a place called Trieste. Why don't we do the same thing here? So that need for change and that increasing clamor for change has made people seek out what's happening in Trieste and what is that model, and whether we can begin to base the innovations in our country on that model.
Yeah, no, that is beautiful, Sashi. And I love what you said. You called it an Anglo-American blind spot, which might still exist. And even I, as I have told this story over and over again, I will have people challenge me, what can we learn from Italy? And it's like, what do we have better to offer? Italy offers a North Star that shows that we can be kinder to people. We can treat people right. And also the notion of human rights is far different than civil or constitutional rights. That's a topic for another day. Mm-hmm.
Again, the significance of what Roberto said about locked door. It might sound like a very simple thing, a very obvious thing. There are no locked doors in Trieste. There are no secluded treatment. There is no seclusion of people with segregation of people with mental health problems in the facilities. There is no forcible coercive intervention. Now, that is not something that is very well known, but it's unthinkable for most Anglo-American psychiatrists because we have become inured to our practices, which constantly and repeatedly deny people their liberties and freedoms. And we so freely impose restrictions and confinement and containment of individuals. This is part and parcel of day-to-day psychiatric practice. It's not an exception. It is a part of almost everything we do within Anglo-American psychiatry. When we visited the emergency rooms in Los Angeles, when we were there 2 years ago, almost every individual who walked in through the front door of the emergency room was constrained, confined, or physically restricted in some way. This is a daily, regular occurrence, and this pervades our practice. Now, to say in Italy they never do that is treated with a degree of suspicion, as indeed, one of the first reports of Trieste experience in English was a report by two people who went to Trieste from England. Catherine Jones was the name of the woman who led that. And she published a series of articles which implied that in places like Trieste, they were hiding people who were under restrictive care from public view. That was the degree of incredulity associated with what they were actually seeing with their eyes. So they had to imagine there were all these practices going on somewhere else, although they couldn't see it. And to me, that reveals the lack of understanding, not only about what's happening in Trieste, but also a lack of awareness what we are engaged with day to day, and that the new possibilities are potentially possible for us. I mean, we can do things differently.
I do want to jump forward to your trip to Los Angeles. Roberto, why don't you add what you wanted to say, but then I want to bring us to 2018.
Let me say, the starting point for Basaglia was the impossible encounter, because he was studying a different way of practicing psychiatry that was called anthropophenomenology, that was looking at the person beyond and outside the diagnosis, trying to find an encounter where the therapist and the patient can have a human communication and an exchange. And he found this was completely denied and impossible in the psychiatric hospital. So he started to say that the psychiatric hospital is not a form of treatment, not a form of care, but is something which is blocking the possibility of care, arresting any possibility. And so his work was to dismantle this construction around the possibility of the encounter. So discovering the person means destroying all this system of oppressing the person, so as a human being. So this was the real start for his transformation. I think this is still what is the most important in my personal experience, in my career, and I think also Sashi's one. So we have to find a different level of communication than the one that is allowed and legitimated by psychiatry as a so-called science. We have to try to find the possibility of understanding the meaning of the experience of a person, but we have to, as a first step, we must find the person. So if we don't reach the person, we cannot have any narrative. So in order to do that, you have to recognize a reciprocity. You have to recognize a power to this person. And you have to fight against all the possibility of oppress and deny all this. This person must be recognized as a human being. So I think this is very important. It is at the core of the transformation of psychiatry, and possibly at the core of a humane, community-based system. So it's not just because of people are angels, people are political activists. No, it's about making really professional help work, creating the possibility of a human connection. That's the real possibility. That's the real thing. And I think unfortunately, we find in mental health and in psychiatry many forms of denying this possibility. So that's what we found in Los Angeles, basically.
It's so profoundly simple to look at who is the human being that is underneath all of the rules and regulations and structures and culture that is holding back their ability to flourish knowledge, right? So we have to fast forward because Los Angeles did enter into a collaborating agreement with the Trieste system under the International Mental Health Collaborating Network, which allowed and afforded LA County and your system to begin discussions and contemplation. I always say to people, we cannot adopt Italian culture. We cannot do that, but we can adapt what is beautiful about the guiding principles in which people are treated. So in 2018, in September, we brought 5 of you out to Los Angeles for a week to tour our systems, to continue this collaboration. And we visited everything from Skid Row to LA County Jail to the hospital, as you mentioned, Sashi, to some locked residential facilities, to a local drop-in center. We met with parents to give you a sense of what we're grappling with in Los Angeles. Maybe both of you could share some of your most significant memories from that week. I personally, as I walked alongside you, felt ashamed to be an American as I watched things unfold from the eyes that you must have been seeing things. Sashi, what do you remember about that week?
Well, it was in many ways an eye-opener for me. I did know how dire things were in the United States. I do know a lot about how mental health services are organized and how they operate in the United States. I knew that before I came to Los Angeles. But nothing prepared me for what I saw there, particularly walking down Skid Row. Now, I have been to different countries. I've been to some very poor countries with very poor mental health care. I've been through the institutions in some very impoverished circumstances in different parts of the world. But nothing had prepared me for what I saw in Skid Row. And that were people with active, to me, untreated mental illness, severe forms of mental illness, wandering around with nothing. No food, no shelter, no one to look after them. What struck me, what really got to me, was the realization that this was happening in one of the richest countries in the world. We were put up in a hotel in a very nice part of Los Angeles, just a few blocks away from there. We were coming across this reality of human suffering. More than that, the apparent neglect of the city, its citizens, and the system of this group of people. And it also struck me, predominantly, there were people of color, that these were people, citizens of place, but who were left to suffer, neglect themselves just because they had significant mental health problems. And they were not getting even the most basic forms of treatment. And the other experience that stayed with me was visiting the Twin Towers jail, the correctional facility. Again, the appalling neglect of people with severe, obvious mental health problems and how they were being chained to the desks during the day, how they were seen as innately dangerous so that people will not go anywhere near them, even though people that we spoke to appeared to be no different from other people with mental health difficulties. One of the young lads that I went up to and talked to was pleased to see me. He greeted me with apprehension. But once I started talking to him, a huge smile broke across his face. And he was happy to make the little human contact with me, asking him how he was and what was the matter with him. Complete absence of any human contact, let alone any treatment or help. And that was a searing experience. Those things stay with me. But at the same time, I also remember, and I don't want to just say things were so bad, nothing was good about it. We also came across some wonderful practices and people there. For example, we saw what Anthony Ruffin, an outreach worker, was doing in Skid Row, almost by himself, as part of the home team but almost by himself, walking the street up and down and trying to help people. And they knew him by his first name. He had a relationship with them. We went to the downtown women's center, again, where women with significant mental health problems were being not just looked after, but there were human contact and involvement in their lives. And they showed a passion and commitment to these individuals. The Sacramento Center, I think it was in West Hollywood, a small day center providing food for homeless people, many of them with mental illness, with very, very scarce resources. Wonderful, wonderful work that they were doing through the engagement with that group of people. What certainly struck me was the absence of any formal mental health involvement, even in places like the Sacramento Center. We didn't see any psychiatrist or mental health worker there working with these people. And these were people who were trying to do almost impossible things under extremely difficult and challenging circumstances in dealing with people who had major problems. And I would be very surprised if I come across the same degree of neglect anywhere else, say in this country.
Yes, oh boy. I'm remembering each of those experiences as you described them, Sashi. Roberto, what do you recall from that week?
This very shocking situation that Sashi described was also hurt me like a very strange social experiment, of which I don't understand the meaning of that. So a form of tolerance or sort of maybe an open door asylum. This was the idea that came to my mind, because people are in a way they have no chances to have a better life. So that's so in a way, even if they were in a sort of apparent freedom, they were completely deprived of anything. So, and the question how a community, how a society cannot take care of some of their more, less lucky members, or I think they are all fellow human beings. They are brothers and sisters of people in Los Angeles. So I think that this was completely shocking me. And also the proud attitude and sometimes the appearance they had. So despite this condition of deprivation, despite this humiliation where they are, I remember some faces which were very much, inspiring me for possibility of a better life. So I think this is, I agree with Sashi. We found a lot of wonderful people working in services, particularly those who were very close to the bottom levels of the people actually are in need of receiving care. But also we have seen, I personally noticed that this very, very much fragmented system. So for me, coming with so many years of medical practice in a community mental health center where every day you are going on the tracks of the people you are following, or the people who are in touch with you, trying to not to lose the contact with them, trying to avoid it. They go even into the private because we are proud to offer the best possible care, etc. It was a bit shocking to see that some of these places, like Hollywood Clinic, typical traditional outpatient place where people have appointments, but they can come from everywhere. They don't belong to that particular community based in Hollywood. They can come from everywhere. So there is no responsibility for the clinicians about their community. The people living in their community. This was the most important thing for me. And everything it was offered, sometimes with some good level of professional competence, but in a very disconnected and disrupted way. Then you have the result of that was the prison, the shocking place we visited. And I think maybe Sashi can make a better description than me, but the Twin Towers was for me the highlight, because in the Twin Towers, I saw people in chains. And I thought it was just in the Woody Allen movies, people escaping from some colonies but it was in the reality, they were chained to furniture, to tables, and then unchained just when they have to access a talk with some of the guards or the professionals who are working there, beyond a very high glass, so disconnected by the guards, which were looking at them the whole day like animals in a cage. But they were no animals. So some of them were laughing at us, smiling, cheering. And so we started to have some conversation, very simple, opening the door and starting to get in. And with my limited American English, I started to talk with some of these guys. Sashi did much better than me. And so And we asked some questions, very simple questions. They are all normal people like you and me, but with a more unlucky destiny than they were there. So, and this impressive prison, like hospital or a prison, it was a mix of both, or not a hospital, not a prison, with about 5,000 people inside. Was an incredible experience. So with even all these forms of restraint inside. Well, Italy has been declared by the European Commission, the Commission of Prevention of Torture, having trespassed the basic rules because of the overcrowded prisons we have. But you have to imagine that in Italy, it's impossible to restrain a person in a jail. It's forbidden by law. So, and seeing this like a normal practice was shocking to me, and particularly to people who were mentally ill, which must receive care, etc., etc. So this was terrible. Other places were at the same time too much traditional. So I was impressed because I was thinking that California was a cutting edge of innovation, also in mental health. But we found some very traditional clinical place. I don't want to mention the name even. Or some residential facility, even with locked rooms, with a space for unlocked people and with a space for locked people, and with a locked garden, with like a cage, like very high bars to go into the sky. So like in a cage, like a bird in a cage. And these were the things we have found. And on the other hand, great human engagement of many people that want to change, mostly probably in the nonprofit sector. But I'm sure that when you start a change within institutions, within public services, you can create a different approach. You can create a different wave toward changing things and transforming things.
We are going to have to tackle some of the other things I wanted to talk about in our next and subsequent episode. I thank you both for being there that week, and I thank you for not giving up on us, because I think you rightly say there are people in the nonprofit sector, in the community sector, and even in the political sector who know that we have to change. And it's almost impossible to think about where do we start. So I just want to ask both of you, as we close down this interview, what would you encourage us in Los Angeles and in California and in the United States, or how would you encourage us to not give up on our desire to see things better? The LA County pilot has been put on hold because of the pandemic. Maybe we should start with smaller ideas. But what would be your words of wisdom to those who are listening to this, who want to believe that we can do better? Sashi, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the way I approach this, not just in relation to what's happening in your country, but also here in my country, the United Kingdom, it's not primarily about money or resources. We are always led to believe there is a lack of resources in mental health system that results in these indignities and very poor quality mental health care. There's a huge amount of money being spent in mental health care at the moment, both in the United States and here. It's not just about that. Of course, we need money. We need enough money to do things. But we are two of the richest countries in the world. United Kingdom, United States, California is a very rich place. So it's not about lack of resources or facilities. It's about our way of thinking and how we organize our practice as psychiatrists, as mental health workers. Country is not like cutting-edge medicine, latest cancer treatment or cardiothoracic surgery. It's not hugely dependent on high technology and hugely expensive interventions that we need to rely on. Psychiatry is about human relationships. It's about trying to help people who are going through distress through our own interventions as individuals being involved with them. And we need to kind of start with that. Because whenever we say we need to change the system here, we got to improve the system in the Twin Towers. Always people talk about, do we need more staff or we need more beds? I would suggest that's the wrong way to start. We need to change the way we approach this, approach individuals who are in distress and how we treat them. The second idea is that I agree with you, Kerry, that we need to start small. We can't start with a top-down model of change and reform and intervention. It'll never work. You will have to build up from the grassroots where things are already happening. I refer to the work of Anthony Ruffin Institute. I refer to the work of the Downtown Women's Center, the Sacrament Center. There are people who are trying to help people on the streets in West Hollywood who are homeless, mentally ill. We got to start with that. And we got to nurture those innovations. What's important here is leadership, people stepping up and saying, we're going to do this. What's important here is changing our clinical practice, how we interact and try to help people who are in distress. Resources will always follow if we start with those innovations, and if people who are damaged by the current interventions speak up loudly, persistently, and campaign for change, as indeed you're doing with Heartforward.
Thank you, Sashi. Roberto, your thoughts. Where do we start?
No, I think there is a lot of hope, apart from the recognition that it's very rare to find a leader like John Sharing as the head of the Department of Mental Health, which was very clear about the values behind the action of creating a different system. So I know he has an enormous amount of resistance and problems. But on the other hand, I think I'm very positive and optimistic because I think that again, we have to follow a very simple principle, following the person, looking at the patient as our point of reference. He's really guiding us. So not losing the contact with this person, following this person in his whole life and his pathway to find care, to find decent conditions of living, a decent quality of life. And so that's our guide. That's our guide. And so it's not easy because there is a disrupted system, as I said before, fragmentation. Everywhere services are not talking each other. They are in isolated silos. But if we start with the person, we can accompany the person in the right places and to try to reconnect all this disrupted system. I think this can be the lead. And in order to do that, you can also find alliances. You can find people who are honestly trying to do their job or to change their job in a better way. I have a lot of positive feelings about what I've seen in Hollywood and in Los Angeles. Don't forget the police. For instance, the police was fantastic in the approach to crisis. We were with them looking at an intervention, I remember, in a school. I don't think in Italy you can find the police so well trained in mental health. But the paradox is there were no psychiatric operators working with them, not so easily available. They can come after hours, or they can never come, or they have to bring the person to some casualty of a hospital, of a mental hospital. So you have a lot of elements in the system that you can try to bring together in an alliance. But the focal point of the alliance is the patient.
You know, I know there's going to be a lot of people listening to this who are going to feel very heartened by the fact that you have hope. Don't give up on us, and we won't give up either. So there's more things I want to talk about next time. And just to give our listeners a thought, there were a few more experiences that you did have during the week that you were here, and we will talk a little bit about your conversations with families of loved ones with mental illness and the different way in which families are marginalized in America, but are actually included in the Italian system. We'll talk a little bit more about the criminal justice system. And I think it's very good that you brought up the high caliber of law enforcement commitment to crisis response and de-escalation of crisis. They don't get enough credit. And we've had great partners with the LA Sheriff's Department and the Los Angeles Police Department who came along with us to Trieste and who are doing very, very good work. I also want to explore more next time about the difference between human rights and civil or constitutional rights. I remember at the conference we attended last September, there was a long discussion about human rights, and reframing the American mindset on what that means is, I think, a critical conversation we have to have. It's not something we talk about much in the United States. And then finally, we didn't even touch upon the pandemic today. And I'm aware of this report that you both co-authored with several others that was initially issued in the spring. And I'm just going to share this from the introduction because we'll explore this more next time. You said, with the spotlight on general health, mental health care suffers in silence. This was at the beginning of the pandemic.
The need for mental health services has never been greater, and sooner or later, most of the population will experience increased discomfort and stress, particularly those with existing mental health problems. We must rethink mental health and mental health care in the era of coronavirus. And those were very prophetic words that you wrote in April, May, and now we are toward the end of November, and we're seeing great evidence of that. So we'll explore that next time as well. I thank you both for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And now it is your evening, and you can settle down for the day. My day is just beginning.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Bye-bye.
All right.
As you can see, there is so much more to talk about. And I am so grateful that Roberto and Sashi agreed to come back for a second interview, which you will be able to hear next week. I'm hoping that there is a new generation of clinicians listening to this podcast, and policymakers too, who feel as inspired by this approach as Roberto and Sashi did as young psychiatrists landing in Trieste to get closer to the movement that surrounded Franco Basaglia. Sashi mentions the Anglo-American blind spot that tends to view psychiatry as more of a clinical intervention rather than see it as an intervention based in human relationship. But they have not given up hope, nor should we. They have seen that we too are capable of meeting people where they are at with kindness and dignity and consistency. We have not discarded our hearts. It's just that the systems and institutions and rules get in the way. And that is why this podcast is called Heartforward. I give all the credit for that name to Dr. Jonathan Sharon, head of the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, who coined that hashtag for our group visit to Trieste in November 2017. If we lead with our heart, imagine the possibilities. Next week, please return for part 2 of this conversation with Roberto and Sashi. It will be the last episode in this first season of Heartforward Conversations from the Heart. Thank you to my collaborating partners, Peer Mental Health, and especially to Paul Robinson, whose technical and editing prowess makes this podcast possible. Please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast and to review it and share it with others. That will really help us make the case to continue with Season 2 in 2021. Ci vediamo.